From the moment I started working, I was like, I want to make this better, faster, better, all of those kinds of things. There are times I think the world is a place for extroverts. So there are struggles being an introvert. You can't progress without being uncomfortable, and you have to have bosses that push you into being uncomfortable. It really worries me that some university presses may not be here or may need to pivot in a way that's so unfamiliar or not comfortable for them. I am doing the podcast to support you and other women. Sorry, Paul, not necessarily you, but like, Lauren has the cleanest apartment like I've ever been in my life. It's almost so clean. I'm worried about our friendship.
Hello and welcome to Midnight at the Casablanca. I'm Lauren Kane, and this is my first solo guest hosting stint, giving Paul Peters a well-deserved break. And today I'm speaking with Wendy Queen. Wendy, I have to say I'm a little impressed at my power of persuasion of getting you to do this.
Thank you for having me, Lauren, I think.
Is that a genuine thank you?
Yeah, it's here to support you.
Okay.
I'll put it that way.
Okay. Well, I was steadfast that you be the guest for my first solo outing for two reasons. One, there's of course a comfort level in interviewing someone I've known for a long time and who is a very good friend. But also, two, you are a fantastically talented and interesting person who never talks about themselves and would never have done this for Paul or for most people. So I do feel like...
That is true. That's true.
I do feel like this is a real get for my first solo go. So thank you genuinely for agreeing to do this. And we should set the stage. This is the first recording of the show, I believe, in the U.S., and we're here in D.C. before the U.S. STM meeting.
Correct. And a beautiful apartment of Lauren's.
Oh, thank you very much. And I have plied Wendy with a very Casablanca-appropriate Aperol Spritz and with the promise of sushi later. So you are, I hope, in a conducive mood to discussing your path. So I want to start the same place that Paul usually starts. So let's go back to the beginning. Introduce us to 21, 22-year-old Wendy. What was she like? What would she think of Wendy now?
I was working in an art gallery, and I was working as an artist in mixed media. And I was doing actually fairly well, showing, selling, all of these things. And suddenly, every time I would read like a write-up of my work, or I was, selling the work, whatever it was, I realized it doesn't satisfy me. And at the time I was working for an artist, a really accomplished ceramic artist. And at that point she said, go back to grad school. And it took me a while to get there. And it took a lot of conversations with friends that are much smarter than I am. And I found a program at University of Baltimore to study under a person named Stuart Malthrop, who is one of the founders of hypertext as a literary form. And at that time, there weren't a lot of programs, and there weren't a lot of like digital exploration of the arts and things like that. So I had the luxury of studying under him for a few years and being in classes of like 4 people that were interested at that at a higher level. It's kind of a boring answer to that question, because really if you're going back to what did I dream my life was going to be like, it was a lust for travel and experiences. And I do love the arts. I will always love the arts and humanities, but I really wanted the world to be a very big place for me. So that boss that was like, go to grad school, like you are the person that needs to go to grad school. She was also like sort of a worldly person who would do things to me like, hey, I need you to go to this gallery in Manhattan. And I was so ill prepared at 22 to be like showing up in like, I don't know, my suit jacket from Express or some sort of like mall like solution. And she really pushed me out into very uncomfortable situations and got me out in the world. And she's still a very dear friend to me. And she was the person that the first time I ate at Balthazar, she was the one that took me. All those kinds of little things that gave me sort of the zest for the life I dreamed of. And in many ways that manifested and it came true. So I owe her a great deal for that. Yeah.
Well, obviously, the world of scholarly publishing is a little different than the world that you came from. But in some ways, you see the echoes of understanding that the world is a big place and wanting to discover more of it that kind of still comes through, I think, in some of the places that we're going to talk about. So the first thing that officially shows up on your CV is work at a company called Imagination in 1999, prior to your work at the press. Is this kind of what you consider as your professional starting point in this world?
Sort of. So somewhere in grad school, it was very apparent that sort of technology, coding, those types of rendering, I was very much into 3D rendering and artificial spaces and things like that, and studying under Stewart. And at the time, that's during sort of that dot-com boom, right? So Imagination was a firm in Baltimore, and while finishing grad school, I worked there. And this actually leads directly to Muse, because at one point, Stewart, the graduate advisor, said, you need to go up the street to the press and work for Muse. And he was one of the first editors of a journal called Postmodern Culture. So he was really, and that was one of the first journals in Muse from Hopkins. And so he really was the person who sort of catapulted me. And, you know, at the time, this is during like a dot-com era where you had the instant millionaires from the stock options and things like that. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to walk away from that and I'm going to go make $35,000 at the entry level. And this is going to be great. And, you know, and it was. I did do it. And, you know, 6 months later, the dot-com bubble burst and I had health insurance. Others didn't. And all is well. And 20 plus years later, here we are. So
that was kind of fortuitous then, that you kind of started at the press when you did and left behind, you know, what might have been in terms of the private sector at that moment. So you started at Johns Hopkins University Press in 2000. And as you said, you're celebrating 25 years there in May. Would you have imagined at the beginning that you would still be there today, be in a very different capacity?
Oh, absolutely not. But with that, I'm not sorry. Sometimes people, when you say you've been someplace that long, they're like, how could you possibly be there that long? And I can say, like, I've never been bored a day. I love Muse, right? And I loved Muse. Like, from the moment I started working, I was like, I want to make this more, better, faster, better, all of those kinds of things. And fast forward, that comes true. And actually, not only, I guess, is it my anniversary for 25 years in May, it's also going to be my 10th anniversary for being the longest serving director of Muse. And I anticipate having another director in place somewhere around that time. So I'll be like exiting on the 10-year mark.
So many questions about that early time. So we're talking about early 2000s. I'm curious about what was the university press landscape like at that time, and what was Johns Hopkins' relative role, Muse's relative role that you remember, and then kind of follow up from there. What in those early years were you doing at the press?
So I didn't realize how significant this was until much later. When I joined the press, the reason they posted another role, and it was in the tech department, was because that was the moment Muse went from being a product of Johns Hopkins University and the library to an aggregation. So I came on at the same time the aggregation was born, right? And at the time, I was like, I didn't know anything about really publishing, aggregations, whatever. You're just doing the work somebody's saying to be told. But it's been a real benefit that I've been there since day one. And I feel that way about my career in digital publishing, period. Like, I've been there since the beginning. So there's not a lot of topics or changes that you haven't experienced firsthand. So At the time, I was just like a good worker bee, right? And had to get used to that university press landscape, and quite a difference from the .com. I mean, it's almost like everything about the .com sort of is true. Like the thing that annoyed me the most at work was like the contractors they'd hire from Microsoft, like playing ping pong over your head while you're trying to get something done, something like that, you know? So it was culturally, it was a tremendous shift.
So I think this might actually be a good time to explain a little bit about Muse. Obviously, people should know Muse, but just in case some of the listeners don't, I've certainly tortured them with enough about Bio 1, but maybe explain a little bit about Muse and where it sits within the press and our overall ecosystem.
Right, so Muse is a division of Hopkins Press. We serve nonprofit publishers in an aggregation space for journals and books and other materials. And so, long story short, we represent like a great deal of smaller publishers, and we're able to provide them the services, the platforms to get their content out to the world, very much in parallel to what Bio 1 is doing. And so we take that role very earnestly, because a lot that we are able to do, university presses wouldn't be able to do for themselves.
And so in 2010, you became associate director of Muse under Dean Smith. And so what was the trajectory? That was, 10 years after you first joined the press. I assume you'd kind of taken on a number of different roles during that time. And you were taking an interest, certainly, as you said, in the technology of Muse and of the press. What were the other things that were your chief priorities at the time?
At one point or another, even becoming a director, I feel like I had every department within Muse report under me, and I welcomed it. Dean was also great at giving opportunities, like really uncomfortable opportunities, so that you can get the confidence it takes to lead, and ultimately you can't progress without being uncomfortable, and you have to have bosses that push you into being uncomfortable.
When did you know that it was time to lead, to take that next step?
There's a process at Hopkins, and no one just sort of is given a role. The succession planning is absolutely there, that you're giving people the opportunity to gain the experiences, but you do have to go through sort of a formal, you still have to win it. There's no other way to put that. And that's not a given. And in that interview process, I actually did not think I would win it, that it would actually be harder for an internal candidate to come in than it would be for an external.
And how did you know you wanted it, though? Because again,
I wanted it because I'd been there for so long, and I was like, well, if I did this, I would do it this way. And it's interesting because since I'm switching roles, I'll say to apply for that job, they required the applicants to write all of these essays, right? And there's nothing more intimidating than to submit your essays to a bunch of publishers to critique. And so I recently reread those that would talk about like what my vision was for being a director, what my vision was for Muse, all those types of things. So it's kind of nice I just reread those, because I got to sort of check off what I started with, what my vision was, and at this 10-year mark, like, where did I land?
Now, one of the things that really interests me is that you're a very introverted person.
True.
And obviously this can make for a highly effective leader, but I would suspect there's some reconciling your ambitions and your talents with someone who is not particularly comfortable with being center stage, and that there must be an inherent challenge there. Is that something you felt or still feel?
No, because even though I am introverted, like that's, I guess if you believe in Myers-Briggs, it's scientifically proven. If I have a job to do, that's not where the introversion comes in. But I also think it's helped Muse, if I can be, I guess, bold enough to say that, because one of the concepts 10 years ago that I was writing about is that Muse needed to not sort of stand on the shoulders of one persona, right? That Muse needed to be Muse. And I've worked very hard for 10 years that it's not just Wendy as Muse. Like, I have a lot of amazing colleagues and a lot of really talented colleagues and a lot of people taking the stage to represent Muse, and I'm incredibly proud of that. And I don't know, is that a result of being an introvert? And that's why I think that's the way to go. Maybe, like, if I'll have to ask a therapist about that. But with that, I am suspecting that your next question is going to be something around when that works for you and when that doesn't work for you. Because as many of you who know Lauren, we're well paired in the extrovert and introvert. We represent the scale very well.
It's a good duo.
It is a good duo. There's room for us both. And, I think there are times, I think the world is a place for extroverts. So there are struggles being an introvert, and there are struggles of like, am I as approachable as you? Am I, all of the things that come with being an extrovert that I am not.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, this is something you and I have talked about that I think will be of interest to people, because certainly, first of all, you're not alone in being introverted. I feel like especially, I think I'm probably a little more of a rarity in our field, so much so that there was, a very highly attended SSP last year. I forget if you were part of it or just in the audience, that was the introverted leader. And we joked about the irony of having a session of forcing introverts to be on a panel to talk about them being introverts. But I think, the intent was that this is something that's challenging for a lot of people, and that it's also just a different style.
Yeah.
But I do think there's also drawbacks in being an extrovert. It was just at ERNL, and someone said to me, "Oh, Lauren, you're always happy. You're always smiling." And I was a little bit offended by it because, first of all, neither of those things are true at all. And I think it was a moment, though, where I understood that what for me is a little bit of a performance, especially when I'm at work, of that's just my style. I am naturally a bit extroverted, but the smiling, positive, happy is in some ways also my professional performance. There's a little bit of me that also takes umbrage at that as a woman, that I'm supposed to be happy and smiling. And I think, again, to turn it around, the opposite is true of you. We've had discussions where you're like, oh, people think I am unapproachable or have RBF or
That's true.
or am scary or, any of these things. But there's a seriousness
let's
to
pause
that.
for a second. People have said that to you about me. So this isn't me making up narratives.
On occasion.
Okay.
Right. But also, this is why you're doing the podcast, and,
I'm doing this, but again, I'm going to be very clear. I am doing the podcast to support you and other women. Sorry, Paul, not necessarily you, but like...
No, but I do think that there is this tension between being perceived as unapproachable or perceived as mean. But there's also, I, again, don't want to have the persona that I am unserious or that I'm lightweight or always happy and positive. And that I think these are one of the complexities or the tightropes that we walk as professional women. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and yet it's hard to kind of get that across.
Right, and I feel that greatly. Like, are there, and I worry about this, are there opportunities because of those perceptions where you're not invited to the table, right? So because I'm seen, let's just say we're all in agreement about this, as more aloof than you, I think most would agree with that statement, that potentially I'm not going to come to the table and be the nice, dutiful female that I can see people really like coming to the table, right? And I worry about that a great deal. And at the same time, you would probably have to ask yourself, am I just being invited because I'm easy to represent a woman and I'm nice and I'm this and I'm that? And I see that.
Am I being invited because I'm palatable or because you think that I'm going to be positive and check this box?
And I always ask myself, how many men have to have all of these internal conversations, and just it's not just these two people sitting at this table having these conversations. I have these conversations with women all the time. So
no, I think that's true. And certainly won't sit here and say that there are not men and men we know and men listening that struggle with all sorts of these things. But I do think there is an added layer of being a woman that you are also just expected to fit in a certain box of, so for instance, that you're supposed to be the serious, aloof one. I'm supposed to be the friendly, nice, fun one. And that then when there are times where, remember that conference where you're like, I'm going to smile the entire time and be friendly to people. People thought you had
that was really hard. My face hurt. And like by the end of the day.
Yeah. And people thought you'd gone insane. And also if I am having a really bad day or I am really negative about things, I've had people say, are you, what's going on? And they are uncomfortable with the fact that I am not fitting into the box that they had allotted for me. So I
can see that.
And we don't have any easy answers for this, but for anyone listening of any gender, I do think it's helpful to hear people talk about this sort of thing.
I think so. Especially one thing I'll note is that I didn't have all of these conversations in my 30s or maybe even my early 40s. Like it really does start being very noticeable in the higher positions that you achieve. And that's when I really notice, are you going to be invited to the table or not? And the differences in the different types.
The other thing I wanted to talk about along that same vein is that your kind of experience as essentially a technologist in this space, because publishing as an industry is majority women. I would venture a guess that this is even more pronounced in the university press space. But within technology and especially technology leadership roles, women are more of a rarity. Is this something that you've experienced?
Since I'm older than you are, I will say the female sort of leadership in the university press landscape is really an artifact of like the last 10 or 15 years, right? And in the technology space, even I would still say that's still predominantly men. It never bothered me. I really never had a real awareness of gender roles. Really, it's been probably the last 10 years. And maybe that coincides with being director of MUSE. I don't know. I will say I really lived in a Pollyanna sort of existence of I have some incredibly wonderful male mentors and colleagues to this day. So when people would talk about certain aspects, I'd be like, what are you talking about? You know, the guy down the hall is the best guy ever, right? And so it took a while for me to come to this, thinking deeply about gender roles and perceptions. But in the UP land, to your point, many more females are in leadership roles. That doesn't mean those females are being asked to the same conversations. I can still say that. I still see that there's many different areas where I'm like, well, that's great. Those are the same 5 guys that always sort of have these conversations, and they're not inviting others to come in a substantial way. They will in sort of tokeny kind of ways, but not in the ways of like being at the table in the early stages of a conversation or an idea.
Now, apologies to Paul, who's editing this, and our listeners who are like, where are we? But this is also a very...
Does this have to be sequential?
This is a very authentic...
We're not done yet.
Very authentic Wendy and Lauren conversation in that
this is an authentic one. This is truly authentic.
Completely nonlinear. But I do want to...
It's a little bit more linear than normally, but...
You still... Yeah. So I do want to get back to your kind of director of Project MUSE era. So in May 2015, you're appointed director of Project MUSE. And I shouldn't say appointed because, as you said, it was a big process to kind of get to that point. This is still, even though you'd been acting as associate director, big opportunity to kind of take the reins, do it yourself, do some of the things that you hadn't or you'd envisioned that you wanted the press to do that you hadn't before. You'd stay in this role for nearly a decade. How would you kind of define this era? What do you see as your big highs and lows, the things that you worked on, you know, the things that you're still proud of, or the areas that you, on the flip side, you know, felt like got away?
At the time, there were a lot of products and programs associated with personas, right? So breaking that MUSE is not synonymous with the director of MUSE, and that the bench is really deep, and that people like the passion that people that come to work for Muse has the opportunity to be out there and to explore. So that I'm going to say is a check. And if we go all the way back, you have to remember that at that time, open access in the humanities was like, people were like, get out of town, right? And so one of the first things I accomplished as a director of Muse is getting a significant Mellon grant to build the infrastructure for OA, which sort of fast forward gave us a lot on the platform to support many different models of OA, but ultimately also leading us to our current S2O Subscribe to Open offering, which is just, in the last month and a half been deemed successful. So that's another very tidy mark about when I started as director and where we are now. So the one thing I have to always be sincere and talk about what didn't I do well, right? I'm really good at talking about that. Muse is a 30-person staff. So we sort of run on efficiencies. We're running by trying to return as much as the money back to publishers as possible. And, one of the things is we don't have direct connections to many of our users. And I wrote a lot in my essays about, connecting to the users. And that's something I reflected on. While we're better at it, we really never really, and I don't know if you experienced that at Bio 1 too, it's always your audience that's the least known or the least approachable. So that I haven't succeeded at. But, during my time at Muse, we've brought books, other materials onto the platform. We've run S2O. We've done a lot of different experiments with other content formats. And so it was a really tiny time at the 10-year mark to say, like, you did it, right? And I'm incredibly proud of that. And at the same time, I'm ready for other people to add to that strategy. I think we have a really amazing strategy now. And it isn't talking about making better connections with the end users. And now I feel bad about that as I'm seeing that document in my head. But it's time. And I mean, it's weird times. We're in weird times. So that strategy is going to have to be really agile. And the next director should be pretty good at pivoting.
Well, and I think you're being, which doesn't surprise me knowing you, but very modest about your contributions and what you're maybe more comfortable with. The press's contributions and Muse's contributions to the overall landscape is enormous. And, as you know, Muse was the precursor for Bio 1, was the precursor for a number of different, not just nonprofit aggregations, but plenty of other collaborative, multi-stakeholder efforts in our space, of which Muse was the starting point. The university press world gets a tough rap, and then some organizations like Muse remain unknown, but they are so critical to a healthy ecosystem.
Thank you for saying that. I just want to say, like, the passion to support university press, nonprofit publishing. My colleagues are around the table. Like, they are enthusiastic, passionate. They are everything to make Muse the best that Muse can be and to serve the publishers and give the libraries a product that they want and hopefully need. I mean, the humanities is always harder than many disciplines to be considered essential in the library market. But I think the passion of the staff really drives that and keeps that going.
So that leads us to now your current position.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier this year, after nearly a decade as director of Muse, you were appointed as the inaugural Chief Transformation Officer for Johns Hopkins University Press. I know this was a highly competitive process for a coveted role. I'm interested in, as far as you know, why the university and the press saw the need, what their plan is, kind of, or the remit for this new role, and also then what attracted you to it personally.
That's a great question. I thought your question was going to be, what is that role? Because that's the number one question, because it is an inaugural role. It is unfamiliar to the UP landscape. So I'm going to give the credit to the director of Hopkins Press, Barbara Klein-Pope. And she's really looking at the long term of, we need more time and resources to make those pivots and to work on those programs that can change the press, that can create sustainability for the press. So I'm not away from Muse. I'm still there. Muse is a big part of our innovation and our plan. And so basically creating this role and carving out the space to work on initiatives like S2O. Like S2O, for example, and I know now, and it really warms my heart that S2O is becoming like a common model that everyone's like, yeah, of course, S2O. And that's exactly what we wanted to happen. 4 years ago, this was not the case. And this has been an incredible amount of work to reimagine an aggregation and unwind 25 years of thinking into how to support these materials and to innovate. And this is a model by Raim Crow. And I remember the moment he first explained the model to me, and it was at the Charleston conference in the Carolina room. Walking away from that meeting and being so inspired that this is something like we may be able to do at scale. And then approaching all of those changes really in a labor of love capacity, because Muse had to continue. The daily operations of Muse had to continue. We weren't ready to make a switch. And now we're ready with other innovations that we want to do, and we want the time and space to do it. And I don't know. So if you said, were you ready to leave Muse? I don't know if I was ready to leave Muse. I certainly would not have applied for another job necessarily while we were launching our first year of S2O. That would feel like, I don't know, I had to see it through, right? And I also had to support all of those around me that were like, in the beginning, like, what are you doing? What are you doing to our operations? And be there for whether it was successful or whether we were under supported and didn't succeed. So I'm not sure I would necessarily have made a move at that time, but it definitely is time to bring more other visions into that director space at Muse. But also I'm ready to work on the innovations and the strategies that we have in this new position. And then I still get to make sure Muse is healthy and happy. So
what's the biggest thing, if you had to choose one thing you hope to achieve in this new role, or for the press to achieve, what do you see that as?
To amplify the successes we've seen with Muse and have experience with Muse in other disciplines, and also to truly foster interdisciplinary publishing as well. A lot of university presses are very humanities, and I think they could benefit a great deal from mixing disciplines a bit more.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so excited to see what you're going to do in this role. So as this interview takes place, we are dealing with the immediate ramifications of both the near and long-term fears of the Trump administration in the U.S. Johns Hopkins University Press is, of course, part of Johns Hopkins University, a major research institution which receives substantial federal funding. What are you seeing on the ground? What are the things that keep you up at night?
Okay, so I can say from, I can't speak for all of Hopkins, obviously. President Daniels has really made no changes, no mandates, communicating that we operate as usual. So in my everyday life at Hopkins, that's not the message. What's really bothering me is when I hear the message of a journal that's not going to get the funding that they needed to support, and what does that mean for the future of that journal. And right now, I think I'm seeing it in very small ways, but I think it's early days. So I get and I'm a planner, and I definitely am a worst case scenario planner. So this question isn't very healthy for me. And in some ways, it comes into my new role too, because the innovation that may be necessary to pivot and to be as agile as possible, I think those skills are going to be very, very necessary to continue, what can we do differently to support those whose funding has been changed dramatically. And then the reality too is we do, for Muse specifically, and for those buying our books at the press or subscribing to our journals, a lot of that money is coming from the library market. And if you hear about university budgets and you're hearing about library budgets, so it doesn't feel like right now, but it definitely feels like that next budget cycle, we're all going to have to be really, really agile, and innovation is going to become even more important in a very different way. So it may not be these big, wide swaths of the funding is there to do a lot of experimentation and things like that. But I do think that we're all going to have to be incredibly clever.
I completely agree. And even before what may lead to a funding crisis, I agree with you. I think that's personally where we're headed. But even before this, university presses have been on
University presses, the humanities. Like in some ways, I'm like, this question has been like
a perfect storm.
What's the importance of the humanities? Is humanities the first thing that gets cut? All of that. And in some ways, what's happening now, the humanities, it's the most important time for the humanities in many ways.
Do you think then, given that the university press, especially the classic university press that is concentrated in monographs, is concentrated in the humanities, do you think that the university press as it exists today will still exist in the future?
I think it's going to have to adapt, right? And I fear for that a little bit, like what gets cut. And I'm in a different situation at Hopkins Press. We don't receive money from the university. We don't get any subsidies, but many university presses, outside of maybe a handful, they do depend on those monies. And when universities start cutting, it really worries me that some university presses may not be here or may need to pivot in a way that's so unfamiliar or not comfortable for them.
My worry is that you're correct, and that what a potential future may be if all of these pressures continue kind of unhindered is that we will end up with either university presses dropping out or consolidating, and that we could have a future market where only a few remain. What do you think is at risk if this happens?
I'm going to go backwards for 1 second and say, as like a community, if we had better community supported infrastructure right now, now's the time that would be really, really handy. And I consider MUSE very much part of that community infrastructure. What worries me is I always look at university presses, and every one of them has their own sort of unique identity, right? And they're all doing things just a little bit differently, that those nuances that each press brings to the conversation would be lost in that consolidation. Like, consolidation makes sense with your MBA degree hat on right now, right? Like, if you brought anybody in, they'd be like, why don't you consolidate? You've got scale, you've got efficiency, you've got all of those top 10 commandments of running a business. But every press has its own voice and its own approach, and I think that could really be lost in consolidation. And I should say I'm on the AU Press's board, just as a full disclaimer too, and I'm not speaking as a board member, I'm speaking with my personal opinion. I should have said that at the very beginning. I'm not speaking for anybody but me.
Absolutely. No, I think very important, but clear.
Yes.
We are only speaking for Wendy's introverted self.
Yes. This is just introverted Wendy.
That is being just brutally bullied into doing this. This interview by her extroverted friend.
That's true. Hostage situation.
But I do think that Bio One and MUSE are positive examples of where consolidation and scale have not come at the expense of bibliodiversity, meaning we are providing that common home for different voices to flourish. So I do think that there are ways to have both. Now, you mentioned earlier that this time with all the pressures, innovation is even more important than ever. And so I'm curious, kind of as a technologist, what do you see the greatest potential for disruption or for innovation looking forward in our space? And thinking specifically kind of about startups or new entrants, do you see them influencing our ecosystem? Do you think there's room for them in this contracting market?
I sort of stopped listening to your question halfway through, I guess, because I was like, well, I mean, isn't it like AI is the topic du jour, every conversation at every meeting, every conference has an AI component.
Let the record show that you brought up AI. I didn't. I'm refusing to bring that into.
Are you?
No, not at all. Please go ahead.
Okay. We haven't had a lot of conversations about AI, so I don't actually know.
No, I would love
on it.
I would love to have your take on it.
I have many thoughts on it, right? And this is sort of prudent to this timeline that we're establishing today, because in my course of my career, I started when the internet was very young, right? And digital publishing was new. And I was involved in a lot of conversations about print is dead. And I just want to say, out of the hundreds of journals that are still on Muse, and there were like 4 e-only journals when I started, fast forward 20 years, maybe there's 10, maybe there's 15. I don't even count them anymore. But the print is dead conversation, that was a very big one. But it was also about, more importantly, to answer your question, the disruption of the internet, right? So I look at AI as like, this next disruption. It excites me. And I mean, yes, I have trepidations about what does it mean? Does platform like Muse or Bio1, are they still relevant in this AI world? Are people going to still want to digest their research, the information in this way? Are we going to get gobbled up? All those.
Is there a need for curators, basically?
Yeah, all of those fears. And some people are going to get really mad at me for this following statement. But then when I think about not talking about such nuanced things about metadata, I get really excited, right? Like, I was like, okay, we can move past that, because it takes so much time and energy, and it sort of keeps us from doing these things that could have more impact long term than that nuanced approach. And some metadata strategist out there will be upset that I said that. But so, I mean, there's no denying we're at AI. I happen to be at a press that doesn't shy away from the things they can also fear. So we're in an environment of trying to figure out where that healthy balance is. So my answer to your question is yes, we're all going to be grappling with, what does AI mean for us? And in some ways, how are we fighting AI, and how are we embracing AI?
One of the things I think is really interesting is that you are all about collaboration in your strategies. Certainly, this is the bedrock of your new position, finding common cause with other nonprofit organizations, ways that you can kind of spread the Muse mission into other disciplines, as you say, work with others to provide that scale. And yet, Muse and the press are famously, and I think in many ways due to your personal philosophy, not on a shared technology platform, but are on your own infrastructure. Now, I know the benefit of this is that you are a perennial potential client to Silverchair, Adipon, and others, and have eaten out very well for many years. We don't want to jeopardize that for you. But can you explain your philosophy there?
Yes, I think I'm going to tell a story. I'm a little bit like searching back in my brain about NDAs and other unfortunate hurdles here. So when I came on to Muse, we had our own platform, and there have been times we've gone out to sort of shop it, and what does it mean, and what does it mean for us long term? How can we do this in a sustainable way, and in a very modern way as well? So we have had the conversation before, and we've done all of those moves. And instead of saying like, this is exactly like, we were so impressed by like the bells and whistles, the exact opposite sort of started happening, where we were like, what? We're doing this for such a reasonable price comparatively to what we would spend, and we have control. And I have not done this exercise in a while, so this is not a commentary to any platform, and I'm sure there's wonderful ways to make it your own and customize it and things like that. But since that point, and you're only going to go out with a platform RFP every once in a while because it's a big undertaking, and you want to be fair to your community too. It's a huge undertaking for people to respond to such a thing. So we haven't hit that point that says now's the time to move to another platform because it makes sense. And again, the driver is always about, are you returning as much of the revenue back to the publishers as possible? So the publishers would have to, or the libraries would have to get something more. If we're saying here, we're raising our expenses by X percentage and you're getting the same thing you've been getting, like it isn't a religion that we have stayed and done our own platform. It's been a very practical, it's worked well for Muse. With that said, things are getting more and more complicated in the technology space. So you have to always be having that conversation before you need to have that conversation.
And certainly one of the ways it's getting more complicated, I wanted to talk a little bit about accessibility. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for our industry in being more inclusive where it comes to accessibility? And how does an organization, especially a nonprofit organization, balance the fact that these improvements are often very costly with the imperative to do these very important things to make our audience broader and more comfortable?
It's a good question. I will say one of the things we sort of skipped over in my resume that was probably very formative about my approach to Muse and things like that is I did teach adjunct for like a decade at University of Baltimore. So I taught digital publishing. So I actually was in the code the early days that the tags sort of started popping up for accessibility, and you needed to code in that way. And so from very early on, it was sort of this Muse philosophy that, hey, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. And along the way, and I'm sure you experienced this at BioOne, then certain states will tell you, like, it better be the right thing to do because we're not going to purchase your product if you aren't meeting these accessibility standards. But I think to your question, why it's very different right now is that not everybody could figure out how to make it work for them, or maybe the platforms were doing a lot of the work for them that it wasn't even on their minds. But the European Accessibility Act all of a sudden says, okay, like, even if you don't believe it's the right thing to do, if you want to sell, you're gonna do this thing. So it's interesting from the perspective of when you've been doing it for so long that all of a sudden, a mandate coming. But I'll say that what I've seen in the university press world is really trying to invest in those workflows to sort of go backwards, to go forwards. And that's not always easy for a lot of smaller presses. So it's not always like a want. It's like, are the resources there to do it? Like, of course, their mission wants it. And sometimes platforms like BioOne or Muse have to figure out how to help them get there. So for some reason, I feel defensive when I'm like, but we've always been doing it. But I really realize that having sort of that mandate approach does force us as a priority, and it's the right priority to force, in my opinion.
Absolutely. No, I think you guys have really...
Without breaking the bank. I'm not saying to everyone out there, I'm not saying go to your backlist and spend millions of dollars trying to do that. But like going forward, yes.
It's a balancing act, but it's still, as you say, a meaningful priority worth pursuing.
Exactly. And to our mission and to your mission. So
slightly more personal, but you can handle it. Paul has talked a lot on this show about work-life balance, and namely to male guests. I have no life, so it was easy for me to respond to. You're a single mom with a co-parent, but still a major balancing act with a demanding job. I'm curious how this experience has been for you personally, and also how it may have shaped your outlook as a leader who perhaps has seen it as her role to create a flexible working environment for the people she works with based on your own experience.
So I'll start with the easier part. The press is a very flexible work environment, whether I want it to be or not. I am. I mentor a couple of people. So whenever work-life balance comes up, I always start by saying, like, I can advise really well, but I'm not really good at doing it, right? Because I have a wonderful 15-year-old son. So I'm a little bit different, where I need to do what I need to do when I need to do it. So I don't really have the same clock as other people. To all the single parents out there, is it incredibly hard to have a demanding job and to be a single parent? It absolutely is. Do I hope that my son, in the times that I'm not necessarily there for him in the way he may believe I need to be there for him, sees the bigger picture? I really do hope that. But it does mean that even tonight as we sit here, I have a little bit of guilt, and I have on my mind that I need to text him to read Act 2 of Julius Caesar and get that homework done, even though I'm in DC and you're probably on a video game. So it's constant. So, but I'm kind of wired that way. So it works for me in that 24/7. And like you said, while I am a single parent, my son Jay, his father also is in Baltimore. So I'm not 100% alone.
Now, you and I talk a lot about mentorship, allyship, how critical it is, especially for women. I know we share a few people in common who have been incredibly influential in our professional trajectories, and certainly you've been one of those people for me. Do you want to take the opportunity to speak to some of the influences that you've had?
It's a very long list because I am full of gratitude for anyone that I've had the opportunity to be sort of open and earnest. And the thing I love about our friendship is we really can have those conversations from, hey, I'm really proud of this, help me celebrate, to like, today I feel like a complete failure, and sort of talk it through without platitudes. Lauren does know I hate the platitude. So you never give me that. I should have given you credit for that a long time ago. So it's all of those sort of intimate relationships where you cross that, where you're like, I can really have this conversation. And sometimes it does require to be outside of your organization for that to happen. But there's been many, and especially just focusing on the female front, I feel like every female boss I ever had has pushed me further in their own way. And they're not all the same. And I think it speaks volumes. Like, I actually have like very close relationships to many of my previous bosses for that very reason, that when it hits that sort of intimate part where somebody's really like, this is the thing that maybe you don't see, but I can see for you, and bring it out. And I hope I do that for other people. That's one thing where I hope I do.
I think that if we have any number of the people on your team, or even beyond others in the industry, I think would say that you absolutely do. And I do think you bring up a really good point, though. And there is something, and especially at certain points earlier on, when maybe you've lost a little faith and thinking that you can make it to the next step, of someone saying, I see something that maybe you do not. I see where you can go. And even if it comes with a healthy amount of constructive criticism of, hey, I've noticed that you do this, or you hold yourself back with this,
or you bomb the extroverted version of this process, which has happened to me, just for everyone to know.
In what way?
In the way that there's certain aspects of like interviewing and doing things that are so performative that it is not an introvert's world. Like, an introvert's world will say, look at all of these amazing things that I've done. You shouldn't even need, like, you read it on my resume, you shouldn't even need to ask that question. So sometimes I think you need those extroverts pushing you to perform a little bit more. I don't know if I answered the question in there, but it's an important point for me to make.
No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I do think there's some people that might say, I had them in the room, I got the job in the room, but then I lost them at the bar or at the restaurant or the,
Exactly.
It's one of the things I think we've talked about, or that Paul has talked about in other podcasts. And it was, I think, initially in the context of the pressures of socialization with alcohol, specifically at industry events. But I think surrounding that is also the pressure to be a fun, extroverted version of yourself, when frankly that shouldn't matter. It should be, can you perform the job to the best of your abilities? But we are social creatures that a lot of times people are gravitating towards people that they want to be out at a restaurant with, or that they want to, have a conversation with. And just to be clear, obviously, you are incredibly fun at a restaurant or in a conversation.
But a small group, right?
But it might not be immediately apparent to people around you. So I do think it is a challenge, or it's a barrier.
It is. But I'm old enough that like I kind of don't care about that point, right? Like, I'm like, if you need me past 9 p.m., then like you don't really need me for the objectives we're talking about. So,
but is that something that is the privilege of being at your stage?
Yes, yeah. Right. But also, yes, it's at the stage I'm at. That's mixed. I'm sort of talking out of both sides of my mouth because I think it is complex. There have definitely been situations and stories that I'm like, that's great that business conversation happened at 10:30 p.m. at a bar, and that's how connections are made. So I have had situations like that. At the same time, I don't know, because I'm older and because I have achieved I'm thinking about my younger Wendy, right? I'm thinking about my younger Wendy, like showing up to the bar and being like, I've got 10 minutes and I'm out. So I have had to navigate that.
So maybe
which is different than you, but I also have friends that are out and I can be like, what'd you guys talk about? So that's good.
Looking back at that younger Wendy, which also might be kind of giving advice also at the same time to people who might be just starting out or might see in listening to this, see themselves in what you're saying. If you could give one piece of advice to your younger self or proxies of your younger self, what would it be?
So I'll say that my son is also introverted, so I'm always giving like sage introverted advice, like, don't care what they think of you. Like, don't even think about it. Just do this. And talking to him about all the uncomfortable situations I've sort of experienced. There's a part of me that would say, and I'm not saying only introverts accomplish things and extroverts just talk about accomplishing things, but I'm not saying that, right?
There's some truth to that, but yeah.
No, but there's like that delicate balance. Like, it's not enough that you just accomplish these things. You have to learn how to talk about those accomplishments and own those accomplishments and be a little bit more, and we say performative in a negative way all the time, but it's really not negative. Like, you need to be able to promote and to get that inspiration or that reaction from other people.
So where do you go from here? I mean, you've achieved a ton. You've given so much to MUSE. You've given so much to Johns Hopkins University Press and to this overall community. Most of it, again, most of your professional experience has been in these venues. If you do end up having another act after that, what do you think it might be?
I'm starting a new act, so that's a hard question because I need to go through this chapter to define the next. But like, I'm not done, right? Like, there are a lot of things I want to do. I think if anything that sort of frustrates me on a daily basis is when I'm like, we got to get out of our own way. We got to get these things done. And I just want it more faster and I have to pull back so I don't stress out everyone around me. So I'm looking forward to this next chapter to help define that. And it goes in a couple of, I daydream in a couple of different positions. But I think also right now with all of the changes that we're experiencing around us in this country and globally as a reaction to that, I'm having a little bit harder time right now daydreaming. And I'm a little bit more focused on what does this next step mean and how do I do that well during those times.
And understanding that you still have a lot to accomplish in this new role with the press, do you see yourself ever working beyond the press, though, or beyond scholarly publishing? Do you think that there's a world in which you go back to the art world or you do something completely different? Or is your heart, you think, completely, for better or worse, in this community?
Okay, so I'll probably never go back to the art world because for the introvert having to read reviews of their work and stuff like that's probably half. I never really thought about that until this podcast, but that was probably half of it where I was like, what? Like, just look at the work. Don't talk about me, right? Like, these are two very separate things. I mean, I'll say one thing that, of course, like, I haven't always been like, hey, I'm committed and I'm always going to stay at a university press. I have put myself out there. I have had those interviews. I have questioned those things. So no, I don't limit it to the university press community. I love the university press community, but there's a lot I want to do. And there may be a point where what I want to do isn't the right match for that. So
now, last question.
Wow.
You've survived.
Sort of.
So as we record this, SSP, which we're both very involved in, the annual meeting this year, very exciting, is in 6 weeks or so, and it's going to be held in Baltimore. Now, you've lived in Baltimore for many years. Obviously, Johns Hopkins and the press are huge parts of the city. I also lived in Baltimore for a few years in the early 2000s. We both love Baltimore and I think have bonded over the horror that most people have when we say that. And I think, I know I hate that most visitors, most people going to SSP are probably not going to get beyond the inner harbor and probably see the worst and most limited parts of the city. So what do you have to say to the Baltimore naysayers?
Okay, first of all, like, I love Baltimore, and I challenge anyone to find another East Coast city that has the same amount of independent spirit. And I live this in Baltimore, and it is, if you want to try to do something, you can do it in Baltimore. Now, keeping it going in Baltimore may be a little bit harder, like that's the reality of it, but you watch so many people be able to experiment in the arts and whatever business and really flourish in that. I want everyone to go to SSP to get out of the bubble in which the hotel that is hosting the conference is at, because it's just like a very ort of Baltimore. And I mean, I already have plans to put people in my car and drive them by John Waters' house just to get them excited about what are things that are in Baltimore that you're not going to find in any East Coast city that's been sort of monopolized by this sort of franchise environment. Like, there's neighborhoods in Baltimore that are completely independent businesses, a good culinary scene. So if anybody has any questions, myself and some of my colleagues would be happy to like make you love the Baltimore that we love.
This is a big offer from the self-described introvert to put all of this.
Yeah. So that's, again, that's an objective. The introvert can accomplish an objective. It's just, don't ask me to have you over for dinner at the same time in my house.
Exactly. So she'll drive you around in her car, but don't ask her personal questions while you're in the vehicle.
That's pretty right.
You can sit in silence and just enjoy all the beauty that Baltimore has to offer. I love
exactly.
it. Well, Wendy, this has just been fantastic. Is there anything else we didn't talk about or that you'd like to add to the official record?
Only that Lauren has the cleanest apartment like I've ever been in my life. It's almost so clean. I'm worried about our friendship. So
it is a little bit of an American Psycho type aesthetic.
Yeah, I love it. Beautiful, though. Beautiful. But very, very clean.
Thank you for adding that to my mystique. I appreciate that. Well, thank you again. Seriously, I know that this was not high on your list to do, but I loved hearing from you. I suspect the Casablanca listeners will feel the same and really appreciate your insight.
I'm happy that you asked somebody from the humanities on this. I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.